Hello, Asia, and hello, world. In the Freedom House, Freedom in the World report, four countries in Southeast Asia were categorized as partly free and one as free. Six countries, however, were categorized as not free, including Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, which held elections in the first quarter of 2026. Laos and Vietnam are one party states where supposed electoral exercises give an illusion of competition and participation amid highly restrictive electoral environments. Myanmar, however, failed to meet internationally recognized standards for genuine elections. In Thailand, the opposition Move Forward Party won the most seats during the 2023 elections, but failed to get confirmation for their prime minister nominee, Pita Limjaronrat, who has been banned from politics for 10 years after a Thai constitutional court's decision which also ordered the dissolution of his party. The party, rebranded as People's Party, is again facing another case where 44 current and former lawmakers will face trial for alleged ethics violations. The people also questioned ballot secrecy during the 2026 Thai elections due to the barcode and QR code elements in the ballots that allegedly could be used to trace votes back to voters. The Election Commission of Thailand has said that the barcodes were used. Wait, I will fix my resolution. I think it's too high. Yes, better. The Election Commission of Thailand has said that the barcodes were used for verification purposes to prevent ballot mismatching and fraud, while the Constitutional Court has taken up the petition related to the issue. In Myanmar, after the military staged a coup after the 2020 general election, the Myanmar junta staged elections in three phases in late 2025 and early 2026 in an elaborate attempt to legitimize its military rule. Throughout the staged elections, the military attacks against the people continued, restrictions that undermine human rights were imposed, and legitimate political competition were barred. The growing tension in the Middle East, meanwhile, that has cut off critical oil supply affecting global economies, has left vulnerable economies to look for alternative partnerships that draw them closer to autocratic regimes like China. Still an international pariah, Myanmar is aligning itself with allies that could accept its legitimization campaign amid continuous imposed sanctions and statements condemning the illegitimate elections. Southeast Asian region, particularly the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is at a crossroads as to how it could handle the changing geopolitical environment, reinforce democratic norms and values, while maintaining its non-interference principle. With elections coming up in the Philippines this year and a new cycle of elections for the other countries in the region in the coming years, this episode of the Election Observer podcast seeks to identify lessons from the recent election-related developments in the region and how regional efforts could be consolidated to redirect the region's democratic transformation amid a trend of democratic regression. In this episode of the Election Observer podcast, ANFREL will discuss lessons from elections in Southeast Asia and the role ASEAN could play in ensuring electoral integrity in the region. I'm your host, John Antiquera, and we are live via ANFREL's Facebook and LinkedIn pages as well as via ANFREL's YouTube channel. The episodes of the Election Observer podcast can also be streamed later on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. With us today are Briza Rosales, ANFREL Executive Director, and Cornelius Damarhanong, Forum Asia East, Asia and ASEAN Program Manager. Hello, Briza and Hanong. Welcome back to the Election Observer podcast.
Good afternoon, John. Good afternoon, Hanu.
Hello,
Good
good
afternoon.
afternoon, Brisa and John and everyone.
Yes, I say welcome back because this is not your first time, the both of you. No, we've had you before
Yes.
in previous
Yeah,
episodes. It's nice to
and
have you
glad to be
back.
back.
Yes, thank you. Well, going straight to the point, for my first question, what do you think are the key lessons that we have learned so far from the elections in Southeast Asia? This can be divided into two parts, no? One, what were the challenges that adversely affected the democracy in the region? And two, what were the best practices that have been observed? Who would like to go first?
Hard question.
Mm.
I nominate Hanong.
Okay, I can start first by outlining the challenges, because one of Forum Asia mandates is actually to have a look at the civic space situations, particularly concerning the elections as well. And one of the lessons learned that we have really observed is who have the control actually of all of this electoral and then governance infrastructure, because we've seen very at least three worrying trend at the moment based on our observations. The first is the growing use of misinformation and disinformation to maintain the political status quo as well, where the government and political actors increasingly use digital media, online influencers, buzzer, and state-linked narrative to shape public opinion and control political discourse. I think we are all familiar with the situation in the Philippines, for example, where the disinformation campaign on social media became highly visible during both the Duterte and Marcos political era as well. And then in which coordinated online networks were used to promote favorable narratives, attack critics, and even reshape historical memory as well. And this has also happened in the last election in Indonesia, for example. The second worrying trend is, I think this is an open threat to opposition groups and then government critics that who have been increasingly attacked and discredited as well. We are all familiar that in many Southeast Asian countries, opposition figures, journalists, activists, and CSOs face legal restrictions, intimidations, or public smear campaign as well. I think John in the beginning mentioned also about the situation in Thailand, where the dissolution of the opposition party, the criminal charge against the opposition leaders under 112, and then under other criminal offenses. It is a worrying trend as well. And even in Myanmar, the election, the so-called sham election was conducted under heavily attacked by where the military attacked different various region in Myanmar as well. Aung San Suu Kyi as the champion of the political opposition were still detained. So this is very worrying. But the third is uh, for formation side, we've seen that the elections themselves are now increasingly being used to sustain ruling power rather than fully uphold democratic principles. And election have been continued. These continue because they provide government with domestic and international legitimacy, meaning that they conduct elections not for the sake of upholding people's right to vote or to participate in democratic governance, but more into legitimizing the status quo, just continuing what they've been doing. This is something that we've seen also in Myanmar, where the military junta pushed for the sham election even before all of the points on the, for example, 5 point consensus have been met. And then despite any critics from global CSOs, global community on that as well. Perhaps I'm going to stop there and then see if Lisa would like to add, and then we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Hanong. I wanted to add, and I'm coming from the last point that Hanong mentioned, especially as we have observed coming from the 2023 elections, and then we have a super election year in 2024, and then who would have thought that 2026 would somehow be an election year for us? So probably one of the key lessons that we have learned so far from elections in South Asia is that when we talk about democracy, so democracy right now is not tested only on election day. So when we talk about democracy, it is tested in how institutions behave before the vote, on how power actually responds after the vote and after the election, and whether citizens still believe their voices matter. So at least coming from the perspective after observing these elections, I think that's one of the key lessons that we have learned from the elections in South Asia. And probably because you mentioned about challenges also. Challenges, Hanong mentioned a lot of challenges already, especially on what we see or what we continue to see in the familiar democratic pressure. So we have seen the problem on disinformation, abuse of state resources, with the restriction of election observers, shrinking civic spaces, and then in some contexts, of course, just like what Hanung mentioned, elections is being used to manufacture legitimacy rather than to reflect the genuine public choice. But of course, with the challenges that we have mentioned, probably I would also highlight uh, the some good practices worth learning from. So of
Mhm.
course, we have seen, at least coming from the Philippines, we have seen stronger use of technology for transparency and monitoring, and then broader engagement of citizen observers, more professional election administration in some contexts, and the growing conversations and efforts on inclusion, particularly on women, youth, persons with disabilities, and marginalized communities.
Mm. I was just I just wanted to go back to what I said earlier during the introduction about, the trend in the region. And that's, if you notice, as in the report of Freedom House, many countries in the region are already tagged as not free. And you see elections as not really something that's competitive and not democratic because of how things in terms of the electoral systems are being changed into how and shaped into how these people in power would want to stay in power. No, but then if you consider and look at the example of the countries in South Asia, particularly after the wave of protest actions and their path towards the realization of a more democratic society, there is this imbalance in the region, and that's quite interesting to look at. And I think something that the Southeast Asian region could also look into as well. But just of course, there are also sectors, and particularly organizations that are working towards enhancing electoral integrity in countries in the region. What do you think have been the significant challenges observed? And also best practices, again, just going back to the positives and the negatives. Best practices in terms of engaging with key electoral stakeholders in pushing for electoral reforms. Maybe we start with you first, Riza.
Yeah, I would answer. Despite the challenges, there are also important signs that we are seeing with regard to democratic resilience. Because you would also appreciate the high voter turnout. Citizens still line up to vote. Young people continue to engage politically. And despite the challenges with regard to the integrity of democratic institutions, civil society organizations remain active. So you would also credit the efforts of domestic observers, international election observers, the journalists, the grassroots volunteers that continue to defend electoral integrity even under difficult conditions. So I would say, actually, it's a good thing and a bad thing, but it's still the important signs of democratic resilience.
Hano?
Yeah, I think if I can add to that as well, many things have been observed. For example, of course, those organizations who monitor the elections also facing severe limitation of resources as well due to the global funding cut, for example, that also affect the ability for the organizations to perform its mandate. But at the same time, we also see how various groups, including think tank, youth-led initiatives, using the technology to bring uh, informations to surface on what happened on the situation surrounding the election uh, as well, in which this is also fits to what Brisa have mentioned when it comes to resiliency of the civil society organizations in keeping the public informed about the situation surrounding the elections. But the bigger question is, this is not only about the day of the election as well, but it's also about the
Mhm.
process of how
Yes.
we monitor the election commitment also until the next election cycle. That is something that uh, public usually forget, that they when the election done, then there goes the euphoria, and then we forgot to monitor. The work
Mhm.
must continue and must be thought thoroughly even beyond the election cycle. So that
Mhm.
is one of the challenge. In addition to, of course, many organizations have received threats and criminalization just because they're also monitoring the election process, in which we're in solidarity with them.
Mhm. I agree with this, no. Of course, a lot of people would tend to focus on election day itself because that's where it's really more apparent, where the electoral exercise is something that you see, something that you feel, something that you participate in. And as Riza has already mentioned as well, people continue to vote. People continue to participate in elections because they still see a value in it. But that, of course, um, the process doesn't end with just the election itself. And that in a democracy, for it to be able to be functional, of course, there has to be continuous engagement from different stakeholders. And the voters are, of course, should be welcome in part of that process and part of those engagements. No? But going back to the regional aspect of the discussion. Of course, in ASEAN, the non-interference principle has always been a key pressure point, in the bloc. But in practice, of course, each country still implements and approaches issues based on their own foreign policy, but it's not necessarily seen as a violation of that non-interference principle. But again, just going back to what you said earlier, Hanong, about the elections being what you would say now, no, in the lingo of the younger people, performative. My next question is, what efforts, because I think it comes from a lack of standards, no, that when people see, there's an election, so that's democratic, right? Because people got to vote. But then you see the conditions in that election, it's not really something that's democratic because people don't really have a choice. It's in the case of Myanmar, for example, these elections were done in areas where the military has a control. So in a way, that's what the younger people now call performative, in a way. But I guess for my next question is, what efforts, have been done to push for regional alignment and improvement on election standards in Southeast Asia? What do we do to surpass the performative elections?
Probably
Uh,
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead,
you
Daniel.
can go first. Okay, I think okay. Let me go first because Brisa has lots to talk about this. I think in terms of what we observe, ASEAN has done in terms of pushing the democratic integrity or about elections. Unfortunately, uh, none have been significantly observed in the face of public. I mean, because whatever under the table, we're not really know. But this is also the biggest questions, whether ASEAN really have the or influencing power when it comes to the situations within their member states, which is the elections. I mean, the democratic principle itself has been mentioned in ASEAN Charter, and then it's also mentioned in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. There's even one article in ASEAN Human Rights Declaration mentioning the right to vote in the governance process, and then ASEAN declarations, ASEAN Human Rights Declaration also uh, uphold the right to peaceful assembly, and then election is participation is also part of the peaceful assembly that is upheld by the ASEAN Human Rights Declarations. But the question is whether these principle is really being operationalized on and shared by the ASEAN member states. This is something that we have not seen. This is something that we have not seen codified further. What does it mean by the principle of democracy in ASEAN? What does it mean by the right to vote? I mean, if we put our attention to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, which is the body that needs to be mainstreaming the human rights promotion and protection agenda in ASEAN, uh, we have not seen any products or framework or declarations that codify this. I think back then there was a discussions, also initiative made by ANFREL as well, on what if we have sort of like an ASEAN framework on democracy or rule of law. Maybe that will be something that will help ASEAN to codify it further. But in a way, what CSOs have been doing now, basically also to push ASEAN, instead of upholding the integrity of the elections, but we push for ASEAN not to, if you, how do I say this nicely? If you don't have something nice to say, just don't involve. That is something that we called for the Myanmar sham election, for
Mhm.
ASEAN not to send any observer, because anything that have been done by ASEAN, if it does not think thoroughly, it will be another source of legitimation by the ASEAN member states that they have done things right in a sense. So it's really at least very low hanging fruit to see that ASEAN have decided not to send observer for the sham election, which is in accordance with what CSOs have been calling for. But again, the ASEAN member states have their own individual willingness on this. So it created big questions where we go first. Are we going to the ASEAN first, or we involve more on the position of the ASEAN member states, or can we do both, in which it requires further coordination, further resource to be deployed? So maybe I'll stop there and then see if Risa will add. I believe Risa will add more on that.
Just to
Yeah.
add to what Hano has said, no, if you notice how countries have been approaching the Myanmar situation after the elections, while ASEAN did not necessarily recognize the elections, you've seen some of the member countries engaging in their own level bilaterally. So as I've said earlier, while the region itself, the bloc itself, implements a non-interference, it's still up to the country themselves to how they approach it, and that they get away with that. Because you see I would not name countries here, but you've seen countries engage in their own way with Myanmar after the elections. Yes, Brisa, we go to you.
Yeah, actually to add, because uh, we've seen ASEAN already cooperates deeply when you talk about security, trade, and then migration. When in some innovative aspects, you would hear cooperation with regard to disaster response, cybersecurity, public health, especially with the pandemic that happened. And you would also hear the non-interference principle. But when you talk about promotional or promotion of regional alignment on election standards, it's very unfortunate that there are actually little or probably none or no efforts have been made when regard to promoting regional alignment on election standards. And when you hear about ASEAN's principle of non-interference, so normally when you use the non-interference principle on regional alignment on election standards, it is often misunderstood as meaning do nothing.
Mhm.
So the challenge right now, that's why the effort coming from the challenges that we have mentioned when it comes to citizen observation. The challenge is on how to frame electoral integrity in a way that it respects sovereignty while also encouraging shared democratic standards. You have pointed out earlier, John, the use of standards.
Mhm.
So that has been one of the challenges. So that's why we start making an effort to talk about at least an issue on how
Mhm.
to raise that kind of standard. So um, probably a month ago, when we have submitted an open letter calling on ASEAN to recognize citizen election observers as human rights defenders. So it is our way, own little way for us to operationalize the different provisions in the charter that emphasizing that election observation is not just a mere technical work that we will be present on election day, but it goes beyond to the work that we are doing, and it is part of the bigger work of protecting democratic participation, the civic space, and the fundamental freedoms across the region. So that's our way, of course, to elevate the conversation when it comes to democratic standards. So probably the approaches that we are seeing here is that we start with dialogue, of course. It is actually a good opportunity for regional organizations like us, ANFREL, and then Forum Asia, and to encourage more, to increase these created spaces where different electoral experiences, human rights experiences can be exchanged without forcing a single political model into different countries, because the challenge will appear when you start forcing a country to promote a democratic standard. So we start small. So that's how we are doing it. We are actually maximizing the opportunity since Philippines is the chair of ASEAN now. So
Yes.
our strategy is to present the election observation. Instead of presenting election observation as an external judgment, so it can be framed along with the standards of transparency, public trust, peaceful participation, and institutional credibility on how ASEAN framing or ASEAN words have been used in the different charters. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Actually,
Maybe
yes, Han.
if I can add one more as well,
Sure.
what Risa has mentioned, that is something, that is a strategy that really important, because if we wait for the ASEAN member state and ASEAN to agree on something, there will be
Yes.
nothing to be developed in the coming
Mm.
years. So those alternative process that is civil society led on pushing the dialogues with regards to elections, the electoral frameworks, and the government governance, that is very important to be highlighted. And then I echo what Chris says, calling for CSOs and more the regional organizations to also join in this kind of efforts.
Mhm. Yes. If you've noticed, I brought out a QR code because thank you, Brisa, for mentioning about the open letter that we released. Actually, it's this month, no, May, because the ASEAN summit happened this
We have the
May.
same problem. I cannot remember when we
It's within
published the
this.
open letter.
It's within this month because that's actually my next question. No? In the open letter, in the joint open letter that we released in time for the ASEAN summit in the Philippines, ANFREL and Forum Asia, as well as like-minded organizations, called for ASEAN's recognition of citizen election observers as human rights defenders. We have a QR code on the lower right side of the screen if our viewers want to see the open letter, want it to be interactive. So if they see the QR code, they can scan it and see the open letter. But just going through that statement, there are two particular elements to it that are connected with our discussion on non-interference. The non-interference principle of ASEAN, and two, there's also a statement of why recognizing citizen election observers as human right defenders matter. So, in relation to the open letter, I wanted to ask first, why is it then important, just to expound more on what you've already said earlier, why is it important as a first step, as an initial step into recognizing into recognizing and implementing um, electoral standards in the region? No? Why is it important for citizen election observers to be recognized as human rights defenders? And how does that contribute to electoral integrity in the region? Who would want to go first? Riza?
Yeah, I would go first. So, of course, the very essence of it, because citizen election observers actually perform a very core human rights function, and that
Mhm.
is promoting transparency, accountability, public confidence in the electoral processes. So in practice, so at least to operationalize it, citizen election observers monitor the compliance with international human rights obligations, including the freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and political participation. So it makes the mandate of citizen election observer inseparable from any human rights framework. So it functions competitively as it performs a human rights function. And number two, to highlight, if you will take a look at the different framework across the globe, we are lacking behind. I mean, it is only Asia who doesn't have that kind of recognition. I mean, recognizing the work of citizen observers across the region. And it's quite ironic because if you talk about citizen observation started in Southeast Asia. It started in the Philippines. But we have not progressed when it comes to promoting this kind of framework and making pushing more commitment from different countries when it comes to this kind of recognition. Yeah.
Yes, Hanong.
Yep.
Maybe you can also speak about your experience at Forum Asia, because I know you work with a lot of human rights defender organizations as well, sectors that are recognized as human rights defenders. So this is not something new. I know Abriza has mentioned that election observers in other um, jurisdictions have recognized election observers as human rights defenders. And just going back to that question, why is it important? Of course, the label itself. No, it's not just any other label. A human rights defender. Why is it important that that recognition is granted towards organizations such as and sectors such as citizen election observers?
Okay. I think the most apparent answer to this is because the election observers, citizen observers, and what I would say, human rights defenders who promote democratic values as well. They're also facing the similar challenges faced by human rights defenders in general, in terms of criminalizations, either it's under foreign agent law or and so on and so forth. So there are similar threats that received by the those promoting democratic values that with the human rights defenders in general. So in what to simply put, because we all face the same challenges, and then we are defending the same values that is in accordance with the international human rights standards, and it should be automatically considered as the human rights defenders. But the thing is, there are also challenges because at the ASEAN level, the term human rights defender itself are not recognized. So now we're asking for two layers of this. One, for ASEAN to recognize human rights defenders as a term, and then for this to recognize the importance of the promotion and protection of human rights defenders or those who promote and protect human rights. And then second one, to also include the citizen observers into the category of human rights defenders. I think there's no harm of asking such a high expectations to ASEAN, because everything needs to start. I mean, just to give an example, that for finally for the after 60 years of ASEAN development, now the term those who promote and protect the environment or environmental human rights defenders are now being recognized under one ASEAN declaration. So maybe that is something that we can hopefully can achieve when ASEAN can finally recognize the role and the important role of human rights defenders, and then subsequently those who promote democratic values like citizens observers. And then I think when it comes to non-interference, we've seen that ASEAN interfere one another in different issues, but not really human rights. that is something that we would like to challenge as well by pushing for this open letter to be known by general public, and then for asking for public to also follow uh, the reactions of ASEAN on this matter as well.
Did I hear it right? You said 60 years. It took 60 years for them to be recognized.
Uh, how old ASEAN is now? I mean, like I'm just making that up. I hope it's more than 60 ish, ish
Actually,
because because since the beginning of the establishment of ASEAN until
mhm,
2025, there you can correct me if I'm wrong. There is no ASEAN document that recognize the importance of human rights defenders or
mhm,
recognize the terminology of human rights defenders.
mhm,
But in 2025, the recent ASEAN Declaration on Environmental Rights
mhm,
mentioned the importance of the role of those who promote and protect the environment, which is
mhm.
I could translate it as environmental human rights defenders, but
Yes.
the in a more watered down terms. But that opened possibility for
Mm,
further discussions with ASEAN leaders
yes.
that finally this
Mm,
terms is recognized, even though it's in the context of
mm,
environment. Maybe in the future there will be more
mm.
contexts to be included, more contexts to be recognized, even more general terms to be recognized as well. I mean, I'm trying to be hopeful
Yes.
on that, and I would like to share because one person hope is just a hope, but if it's like
Yes.
1,000 people's hope, might be a reality. Don't you think so? Right?
Oh. No, I share your hope that it doesn't take 60 years to be for citizen election observers to be recognized as human rights defenders in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely, absolutely. The sooner the better. The sooner the better.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just really weird just to add John and Hanong because
Mhm.
we have the ASEAN Charter, we have the
Yes.
ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, we have
Mhm.
the TOR with regard
Mhm.
to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, of course, ICHR. And then recently, the blueprint, just last year, it was 2025, with regard to ASEAN Political Security Community Blueprint. So it highlighted the importance of democratic values, the rule of
Mhm.
law,
Mhm.
good governance. So they are actually the essential foundations for regional peace. I'm saying that because it's actually there. It's just the biggest challenge right now is the political will on how to enhance this framework, which is already available.
Yes. No, just again
Yep.
to
And then just one more thing.
go ahead. Yes.
I just googled ASEAN is 50. I just googled ASEAN is 58 years old. So people
Almost
don't trust
60.
me when ASEAN is 60 years.
So, so it took almost 60 years for environmental defenders to at least somehow be recognized, but not directly as human rights defenders. But there, of course, the importance of the role of environmental protection in advocates in protecting the environment in the region. Hopefully, not 60 years for citizen election observers. No, but just again to close the discussion on the non-interference principle of ASEAN. In the open letter, you've said that the call to recognize citizen election observers as human rights defenders should not be interpreted as an external intrusion into domestic political affairs or as inconsistent with ASEAN principles of sovereignty and non-interference. Can you just briefly Breeza has already mentioned about this, but can you just expound more on how it's not something that they should consider as an interference when we
Yeah.
discuss about, you know, recognizing election observers, citizen election observers as human rights defenders?
Yeah, because just like what I mentioned, we put it there because the challenge is on how you frame the electoral integrity in a way that respects sovereignty while still encouraging shared democratic standards. So we need to frame it that the value of doing citizen observation is actually doing a human rights function. So somehow, the function of citizen observation, that's the reality that we are facing. We are actually judge. So that functions the challenges also of different citizens observers. I mean, we are judged that we are interfering one's jurisdiction and sovereignty. So it actually goes to the standards and framework available in the charter. It is interpreted in a different way. So that's
Mhm.
why citizen observation shall continue to function as a human right function. Yeah.
Hano?
Yeah, it's just a simple matter that non-interference have been used increasingly in the sense that when we talk about human rights or some sensitive issues, then there goes non-interference. But in a way, if we look at the ASEAN Charter, yes, non-interference is one principle, but there are also other
Mhm.
principles like respect on the
Respect.
promotion and protection of human rights, in which that is also a shared commitment. I mean, under international standard, that it is uh, international community's commitments when there is that human rights issues are concerned, and that it
Mhm.
cannot be just uh, becoming the reason by the ASEAN member states to simply say that, oh, there is a non-interference principle, and then there goes
Yes.
non-interference principles coming to the table again
Mhm.
and again when there is a sensitive issues to be discussed. And then also simply to say, if you don't have nothing to hide, then you don't have nothing to hide, and then just you're welcoming people to see and how it looks like, right?
Mm, that's a good argument, no. That's aside from the non-interference principle, of course, there are other principles out there. Not out there. There are other principles that supposedly ASEAN is or are is upholding, and that should also be considered in upholding citizen election observer rights. No,
Right.
just recalling a previous episode on engaging ASEAN in ensuring electoral integrity. We discussed that there is no similar body to the ICHAR, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, that would bring together election management bodies in the region. And one recommendation coming from that discussion is to create a platform for dialogue among EMBs and key electoral stakeholders in the region. So you've mentioned this. The Philippines is now is now the chair of ASEAN, and supposedly ANFREL is supposed to host the AESF 7 in the Philippines, which we thought could have been a good platform for this, no, but it was postponed. But if we could create a platform for this dialogue among EMBs and key electoral stakeholders, what framework should be pushed forward to establish electoral integrity standards in the region aligned with international standards? I would modify this because there was a mention earlier about low hanging fruits. Maybe we go with modify the question in a way that what are the low hanging fruits that we could pursue and what are like the bigger picture that we should be looking at.
I can go first. I mean, I
Yes.
wanted to nuance the creation of the platform because
Mhm.
right now, at least with the platform among election management bodies, you would hear about Association of Asian Electoral Authorities, but it's not only for ASEAN per se. So somehow similar to that, but with the question on how or what framework should guide electoral integrity standards in Southeast Asia. I mean, number one, the framework should be grounded in the international democratic principles. We don't need to step forward a little farther. We still have a lot of documents and ASEAN framework which is not being implemented well. But to add on the framework that I have mentioned, the most important is to contextualize it for Southeast Asia reality. I mean, that means focusing on practical standards, such as the transparency of electoral processes. And then one important aspect should be, I mean, uh, independence and function of different election management bodies. And you talk also about the access of different citizen observers and inclusive voter participation. And when you contextualize it, it is also a good opportunity to put in the framework the different innovations. Because just like what Hanong mentioned, election right now is not only being contested on in the polling stations. It happens before, and you actually attack democratic institutions, and then you also harness the power of the judiciary. So something about innovation to talk also about what is happening before elections. So the functions of institutions, it will be a lot, but the low-hanging fruit for me, John, would be
Mhm.
strengthening the independence and impartiality of election management bodies, and talk
Mhm.
about the use of abuse of state resources, because it really weakens the accountability standard of a particular country.
Hano?
I mean, to be honest, I'm not really a fan of creating something new within the ASEAN
Mhm.
infrastructure at the moment because we've seen how uh, two human rights commission, the ICHR, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights, and ASEAN Commission on the Rights of Women and Children, are also often being sidelined when it comes to a bigger ASEAN initiative, for example, on the digitalization issues in which ICHR, which I mean, just giving an example, ICHR that is supposed to be the body to mainstream human rights issues within the ASEAN in
Yes.
various contexts, are not
Mhm.
being included in this kind of uh, discussion, in which there are also one side of ways of work that we need to also help this body to push the boundaries even within the ASEAN structure. But low hanging fruit at the moment for me is right to vote, commitment to governance is within the ASEAN Human Rights Declarations. That is something that needs to be codified further by ICHR, perhaps including them in their 5-year work plan, and then see how it will be discussed further together with CSOs. I think CSOs like ANFREL have the capacity to assist ICHR or in coming up with some advisory notes or opinions on these issues. But this also depends on whether ICHR themselves have a willingness to take these issues uh, forward. And then the second one, I think, whichever modality that comes out of this also need to tally with the commitment that have been mentioned in the ASEAN Vision 2045, because
Yeah.
that's the new roadmap that we have to look into. And then if there is a way that we can dissect it and then see where the the election issues can come in, that will be helpful and makes us easier to get buy-in from different ASEAN pillars on this issue as well. Of course, it's easier to be said than to be done, but it is what it is on how I see that. But that doesn't mean CSOs in the region should stop hoping. I mean, in the absence of a regional infrastructure or framework that they have, CSO can create an alternative way of
Mhm.
functioning institution. And I think it's even better because then CSOs are independent as well. And then do we want to entrust something that's supposed to be independent within the ASEAN uh, body or like member states at the moment under this kind of strictly civic space situations? That is for us to discuss further and to reflect together on that collectively.
Okay, thank you. I plan to skip my last questions because usually when we do episodes, we run out of time, but we have time. So for my last question, I don't know if you've seen this before, but ANFREL is holding an election. Of course, we have been doing an interview with people, not interview, but like asking people about what motivates them to participate and engage in elections by completing a particular sentence, which is I vote for blank. In previous videos. One said I vote for better infrastructure, but then some vote for the recognition of citizen election observer rights. So I asked the two of you now for my closing question, because we wanted again to know why you participate and engage in elections. Complete the sentence. I vote for blank. I have the ballots here for you. I will fill them up and put them in the ballot box that we have here. But who would like to go first?
I can go first.
Yes.
Um, I vote for dignity.
Oh,
I vote for
why?
dignity because democracy begins when people believe their voices are worth hearing.
Oh, okay. So this is your ballot.
Yeah, I vote
A
for
vote for
dignity.
dignity. How about you, Hannah? What you vote for? I vote for blank.
I vote for justice and accountability.
Oh, why?
Because
And
we've seen the culture of impunity in the regions in which
Uh,
threats against human rights defenders have clearly unaddressed. So I vote for whoever can bring justice and an accountability to the perpetrators uh, who launch attack to human rights defenders.
this is your vote. Again,
And
that is
what are you gonna do
yes.
about that? I mean, I'm curious.
Good
Yes.
question.
As you said, in I was supposed to play a video, but because it's still my face, so I don't want to hear my face and see my face and hear myself again. At the end of the year, we're going to tally the votes and see how people voted and what their priorities are in terms of how they vote in elections, engage in elections. So there will be a tally at the end of the year. We started this earlier this year, so we'll see how people voted. Thank you for joining our election. I just thought, we're election observers. Why not hold an election? But Hano and Riza, thank you for joining us again for another episode of the Election Observer podcast. It's of course a privilege, and it's always nice to have you on the show. Thank you. I would have to remove you from the feed so for me to formally close the show. But again, thank you very much. Please say goodbye to our viewers.
Thank you everyone, and thanks Brisa and John.
Thank you,
Sure,
John
we
and Hanong. And actually, thank you for all of our followers and listeners in this the Election Observer podcast.
thank you again. I'll hide
So,
you two now to close the show. Yes, and that has been the Election Observer podcast episode on lessons from elections in Southeast Asia and the role of ASEAN, the role ASEAN could play in ensuring electoral integrity in the region. Get the latest news and updates about ANFREL programs and activities to our Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and TikTok pages. You can also subscribe to our YouTube and WhatsApp channels. Please follow the Election Observer podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you again for joining us today in this particular episode. I have been your host, John Antiquera. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.